So, Plato's allegory of the cave. What does it mean, and what are its implications for philosophy, the well-ordered soul, and political order? Who should rule? Plato begins by talking about the state in which most people are born. You can see them here. Children and young people who are chained to a wall and watch reflections, shadows on a cave. They're not aware that there's a life outside the cave, and they're not aware that they're living in the dark with a man-made source of illumination. The only way out is to turn around because someone has told you that the true light and truth is behind you, and slowly make your way out of the cave. And as you come up, as we can see, that man right there is shielding his eyes. That's because the glare from the sun is so bright. Now, what this implies is that truth is overwhelming to us. We can apply this to our modern lives in the following way. We begin to perceive reality as soon as we start learning language, and as soon as we start categorizing things and thinking in terms of utilization and mechanization and purposing objects, instrumentalizing everything around us. We begin to think of them in the way society tells us to, right? So one of our earliest fixations becomes money, because we're told that this means something, this will allow us to get other things. There's nothing beautiful or deeply true about money. It was just concocted by people who are running our society. We've been so accustomed to thinking of something like money as a good, crouching over it, huddling down on it, counting it, making note of it, converting it into units and figures and total amounts and bank accounts and bank balances and so on. That if we actually look up and see the real truth, it blinds us because it's so much brighter and so much clearer than what we had been fixated on. I think that this is one of the messages that Plato was giving us, that through socialization, we become accustomed to thinking about a small subset of reality. Where we shine our light, our flashlight or our flame or our fluorescent light in a classroom, where we shine our light, we believe we're seeing truth. But there's a much bigger world out there, and so it's not that we're seeing things that aren't true, it's that we're seeing a partial and not fully illuminated truth, and that we're using language to describe it that leaves out huge parts of the whole story. And we're being told a story by those around us. We're not perceiving the true forms as they are above ground. So, Plato, though it's often said he's talking about God, and in a sense, there's a big question there. Is he talking about God? Religious institutions often teach children discipline and fear and hierarchy from the first. And I happen to disagree with this interpretation because I think hierarchy is healthy. In fact, I think Plato, as he calls for those who have made their way out of the cave, these enlightened individuals, to go back down into the cave and help the others out, I think he's basically talking about the relationship between parents and children. Now, there are plenty of people who are adults down in the cave who have never found their way out, and there are some probably relatively young people among those who've gotten out of the cave and are perceiving truth well. It looks like those two are relatively older, but that was just this illustrator. I really like this illustration, by the way, of Plato's allegory. But for the most part, it's going to be slightly older people up here, at least mature, and there are going to be many children and young adults down there. And so I actually think structures like the Christian moral education structure, and which calls people to look up to the roof of a church, or to look up at the sky, or to look into nature and see God's designs, they might not be a complete picture of the truth, but they do encourage the beginning of a searching for moral meaning and for appreciating the beauty of the world and for getting out of a cave of ignorance and dogma. Although many people would disagree with that. Many people would say religion is the ultimate practice of tricking people on a cave, and that those people who stand guard and who tend the flame and tell people that the only true thing in the world is these empty shadows, that those are the priests and the fathers and the chaplains and the reverends of this religion. Personally, I'd say that description applies quite well to a religion like Islam, which I think does have a pretty constricted sense of how people should behave as they grow up and throughout their whole life. The number of rules and the amount of fear that is instilled in people, the lack of wonder in the world's design, is a problem with Islam, I think, personally. Whereas I'm much more sympathetic to Catholicism, for example, but again, others will disagree. I think the other thing that Plato gives us, though, in addition to critiquing religion, and obviously the Abrahamic religions came about after Plato's time, the other thing that this gives us a critique of is modern science. Modern science often devises small experiments, very limited scope. The lens focuses down on a couple of variables in a specific area, in a specific university, collects some data, and then tries to apply and draw conclusions from that. And one of the things Plato is saying here is that controlling the world around you and then trying to measure it with this data that's very limited, where you're not measuring all the variables ever, is a little bit like watching shadows constructed by other humans on the wall. You're not open to the wonder of the world, so it's going to kind of cramp your understanding of the world. It might lead you down false past beliefs because of bias from you or from people who are, designed the experiments previous to you in modern natural science. So while some people would say science is the act of getting out of the cave, I would say in many ways much of the experimentation and hypotheses and conclusions that modern natural science, whether it's medical, health, or biology, or anthropology, or physics, chemistry, or so on, many of them have a somewhat cramped view of what it is to understand the truth about something. They're very fixated on translating the real world, which is made of forms that we should understand almost as things working towards some telos, some whole. They have a whole in which they were designed and a purpose for which they were designed. Modern natural science often becomes about deconstructing those things and failing to understand why they're there, and meddling unnecessarily with the natural world, and also creating artificial things that don't actually help, that have many side effects, whether that's medical experiments or new plastics or metals that can be used for building or for use, right? Modern natural science has done quite a bit of harm in terms of distilling chemicals like mercury from the environment and creating them in some of the processes that modern natural science has discovered, and then poisoning people with them. So there's a lack of holistic understanding that those who have made their way out of the cave would have, that many who participate in modern natural science have. Let's talk about moral formation a little bit. Plato certainly talks about that with Glaucon. Socrates talks about it with Glaucon, and Plato writes about it in the Republic. They talk about how ideally a society should be run by philosopher kings, those enlightened who have come up out of the cave. They're not led by self-interest. They're led by a pursuit of truth. They're not fighting for their position as a ruler. They've become a ruler almost as a side quest. They would be happy to live out their lives traveling the world and pursuing truth, or loving others, or designing new inventions, wheels and spokes, and harvesting berries and examining how they are and thinking of them through a scientific lens. But they've become rulers because they're so wise and because they're needed by their state. They're not in love with the salary and the acclaim and the public attention that comes with being a ruler. In fact, Plato writes, Socrates has a great line. He says, if you abandon the state, if truly enlightened people abandon running the state, you end up with politicians who desire power and who love the very seat in which they sit in as rulers, as politicians. And in that case, you're going to ruin the state because you have a lover's quarrel. There are multiple people who love a seat of power. They don't love the state itself, the country which they're supposed to be ruling. They love the seat of power, which allows them to extract money or gain public attention or gain access to people who they want to impress and talk to and befriend and make love with, and so on. They love the seat of power and all the access it gives them. And so you have a lover's quarrel, Plato says. Two people love something, they're going to tear each other apart, and they might even tear the thing apart because they're so bitter at each other and because they want it so badly. So Plato says you need people who don't love serving and sitting in that seat of power, but people who do it as a byproduct of who they are, how enlightened they are, and how strong their understanding of the state is, that they become the rulers. And that's the task of education, Plato says, is leading the young, at least some percentage of the young, up, out of the cave, and into the above ground where they can begin to perceive truth and become enlightened rulers. So, how do we spot people who are enlightened? And how do those people break down and convince the others who aren't enlightened that there are chains around them, when those people often want to believe that they are leading their best life? It's an open question, and there are many interpretations of that. One is to say, following along somebody who came more than 2,000 years later, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss-French philosopher, who said that most people today think they're enlightened because they're so appetitive. They think they've figured out all these secrets about how to gain wealth and land and status, but they're actually being led by their appetites. They're the exact opposite of enlightened. They're just chasing these vacuous shadows on the wall. And so in that case, the enlightened would be people who behave like Rousseau's ideal man, who only take enough fruit and food for that day, and who don't steal from others, and don't regard things as their own property. They almost live outside of society's moral code, but they're so enlightened and not brought down to their base instincts that it doesn't matter that they exist outside of moral code, because nothing they do is harmful to others. And it's not harmful to themselves either. They don't diminish their lives by chasing shallow things. That's the description that Rousseau would give of the enlightened, in which case, monks and some hippies and some homesteaders and some, glampers or so on are probably, and hikers and, painters of the natural world and photographers and yoga practitioners and so on are probably the enlightened of today. Another response is obviously to say that those with the most education, who spend the most time in a university, have shrugged off the veils of ignorance which they were born with and been treated to the best education that our modern world has to offer, and those are the enlightened up there above the cave. And we need to provide more education, more data, more classes for those below. And there are other interpretations of who is enlightened and unenlightened in today's society. It's a fascinating question that everybody will have to come up with on their own. And everybody will have to shrug off some of their own biases, which are likely, oh, you know, my parents are the best, they're the smartest, or I've made great choices, so I'm the most enlightened. But consider that. Consider it deeply, as Plato wanted us to do. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll be back with more videos about classic philosophical literature and texts of this sort. Maybe I'll cover a little more Plato. I do have to read one of Nietzsche's books for a book club that I'm participating in right now, so I might be back with that in a few weeks. But if you like this, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and turn around and make your way out of whatever cave your life is currently stuck in. Good luck.